I'm standing on a piece of ground that has a story to tell, though you wouldn't know it to look at it now. All that's left is a ghost of a chimney, clawing its way out of a tangle of kudzu and briars, and a few foundation stones sweating in the humidity. This was once the heart of the Lincoln family homestead, here in the deep hollows of Lincoln County, West Virginia. The air feels heavy, weighted down by memory. If you listen close, past the wind in the pines, you can almost hear the echoes of a conflict so brutal it was called a war that poisoned this ground and set neighbor against neighbor, kin against kin. Today, we're going to find out why. We're going to listen to these ruins and understand what happened right here that turned a family's dream into this pile of forgotten stone. Let's wind the clock back 150 years. The year is 1870. The chimney we see today isn't a ruin, it's the heart of a home, breathing a steady plume of wood smoke into the crisp morning air. The house it's attached to is a testament to hard work. 2 stories of hand-hewn poplar logs chinked tight against the mountain cold. The porch is wide, and on it sits the patriarch, Colonel Absalom Lincoln, a man as hard and unyielding as the rock-laced soil he commands. His face is a roadmap of hard-won battles, framed by a graying beard, but it's his left sleeve, neatly pinned to his shoulder, that tells the most important story. It's a constant, silent reminder of what he lost at Gettysburg, and a symbol of the cause he still believes in. From this porch, Absalom doesn't see a wilderness. He sees his kingdom. He sees the bottomland, dark and rich, where his sons are already working the fields with a pair of mules. He hears the rhythmic turn of the water wheel at his grist mill down on the creek, the only one for 10 miles in any direction. His world is one of order, built on the unshakable pillars of family, honor, and the sweat of your brow. The Lincolns are not just a family, they are a clan, the closest thing this part of West Virginia has to aristocracy, and Absalom is their unquestioned leader. They believe the old ways are the best ways, and that a man's worth is measured by the land he holds and the word he keeps. Life here is hard, but it's whole. In the house, the women are already at their chores, the smell of baking bread and boiling coffee mingling with the wood smoke. Children's laughter spills out from the yard. This isn't just a farm. It's the center of a community, a place where people come for justice, for advice, or to have their corn ground. For Absalom Lincoln, this homestead is more than property. It is the physical manifestation of his soul, a legacy he intends to pass down through generations. It is a symbol of survival, a piece of the Old South rebuilt here in the mountains. But a shadow is beginning to creep up the hollows. Strangers have been seen in the hills, men with tripods and measuring chains, men in city clothes who speak with northern accents. They talk of progress, of timber rights and railroad lines. They speak of the black rock that lies in seams beneath the earth and the fortunes that can be made from it. To some, this is the sound of opportunity. To Colonel Lincoln, it sounds like a second invasion, a new kind of threat to the way of life he sacrificed his arm to defend. And he knows who is welcoming these invaders. The McCoy clan, led by Black Elias McCoy. They are new money, men who didn't fight for a cause but profited from the chaos, selling to both sides and getting rich while their neighbors bled. The Lincolns see them as scavengers, men without honor, who would sell the very ground from under their feet for a stack of Yankee dollars. For now, the conflict is a cold silence in the town square, a stiff nod at the crossroads. But on his porch, Absalom Lincoln watches the sun rise over his land, and he knows a storm is coming. He can feel it in the ache of his missing arm. To understand how a family's pride curdles into a generation of hate, you have to look beyond the soil and stone. You have to follow the paper trail, as thin and fragile as it may be. I've spent weeks doing just that, digging through dusty boxes in the archives, and I found something. This is what I believe is the first drop of poison. It's a page from the Lincoln County Ledger, dated November 6, 1872. The paper is brittle, the color of old tobacco, and it smells of time itself. Most of it is what you'd expect: crop prices, an ad for a liver tonic, a notice about a church social. But tucked away in a small column on the back page is a single dry paragraph that announces the results of the county election. It officially declares that Jedediah McCoy, brother of Black Elias, had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County. On the surface, this is just democracy at work. But you have to understand, in a place like this, the sheriff's badge was the keys to the kingdom. He controlled everything: who got arrested, whose land got seized for back taxes, and whose brand of justice was enforced. For as long as anyone could remember, the man wearing that badge had been a Lincoln, or a man loyal to the Lincolns. This small, forgotten news clipping wasn't just reporting a political upset, it was documenting a coup. This was the moment the McCoys seized the levers of power, and for Colonel Absalom Lincoln, it was an intolerable insult. This piece of paper tells us what happened, but the question that haunts this story, the question that led to all the bloodshed, is how. That small newspaper column was the official record, the final word. But the story of how Jedediah McCoy's name got printed there was written not in ink, but in sweat, whiskey, and the cold glint of northern silver dollars. On Election Day in 1872, the air outside the Hamlin courthouse was thick with a tension you could taste. It wasn't the celebratory mood of a civic duty. It was the quiet, watchful stillness of two armies waiting for the other to blink. The Lincolns and their supporters gathered on one side of the dusty square, the McCoys on the other. It was a division as clear as a property line drawn in blood. Colonel Absalom Lincoln stood on the courthouse steps, his one good hand resting on a hickory cane. He expected his cousin to win. It was a matter of tradition, of respect. The Lincolns had always guided the county, and their people, the families who had been here for generations, understood that. He watched the proceedings with a stern but confident eye, acknowledging the deferential nods of his fellow farmers and veterans. To him, this election was merely a reaffirmation of the natural order of things, a way of telling the world that the values of the Old South were still alive in these hills. But then came the strangers. They arrived in wagons, a rough-looking collection of men Absalom had never seen before. They weren't farmers. Their hands weren't calloused from the plow, but from the pickaxe and the sledgehammer. They were the survey crews and clearing gangs hired by the railroad interests that Black Elias McCoy had been courting. They were paid in cash and loyalty to the man who signed their checks. One by one, they cast their ballots, their unfamiliar faces a stark insult to the local men who had bled for this ground. A low murmur rippled through the Lincoln crowd. This wasn't an election, it was an invasion by proxy. When the final tally was read aloud, a moment of stunned silence fell over the square. It was quickly shattered by a triumphant roar from the McCoy side of the crowd. Jedediah McCoy had won by a handful of votes, just about the same number of strangers who had been brought in. Black Elias McCoy stood in the center of the celebration, a thin, knowing smile on his face. He had not won an election, he had purchased an office. Colonel Lincoln descended the steps, his face a mask of cold fury. He walked directly to Elias, the crowd parting before him. Their confrontation was quiet, but more menacing than any shout. "You bought this election," Absalom said, his voice low but carrying like a rifle shot in the winter air. "You bought it with northern money and railroad trash." Elias McCoy didn't flinch. He looked the one-armed colonel square in the eye. "The world is changing, Absalom," he replied, his own voice smooth as oiled steel. "It's a new time. You can either get on the train or get run over by it." In that moment, the lines were drawn. It was no longer about politics. It was about honor, about survival. And both men knew, standing there in the dust, that this conflict would not be settled at the ballot box again. Paper and ink can give you the facts, but they can't give you the feeling. They don't have a soul. To find that, you have to talk to the people who carry the story in their blood. That's what led me here, to a small, neat house perched on a hillside, to sit on a front porch with a woman named Sarah Lincoln Vance. She's 87 years old, the great-granddaughter of Colonel Absalom Lincoln's eldest son. Her hands are gnarled with age, but her eyes are sharp, and her memory is a library of stories that have never been written down. I showed her the newspaper clipping about the election. She looked at it, gave a slow, knowing nod, and handed it back to me. "That was the start of the trouble, all right," she said, her voice a soft mountain drawl. "But it ain't the start of the hate. Politics is one thing, that's about power. The hate started later. It started over a boy defending his father's honor. According to the story Sarah's grandmother told her a few months after the election, there was a church social. It was one of those rare times when the whole county came together, a fragile truce under the eyes of God. But the McCoy victory had made their young men bold, arrogant. One of Elias McCoy's nephews, a boy barely 20, had too much corn liquor and decided to make a show of his family's new standing. He saw Colonel Lincoln standing by himself and said, loud enough for a dozen people to hear, "Looks like the colonel left his voting arm at Gettysburg along with his sense." The insult hung in the air, a stunning act of disrespect. The colonel, a man of immense pride and control, simply turned his back and walked away. But his youngest son, Daniel, who was only 16, saw it all. His face went white with rage. Sarah told me that her grandmother said Daniel was the apple of the colonel's eye, a boy with his father's fire and his mother's kindness. To see his father, a war hero, humiliated like that by a McCoy pup, it was more than he could bear. That, Sarah explained, is the real story behind the first death. The official record, the one whispered in the courthouse, was that Daniel Lincoln got into a dispute with that same McCoy boy over a property line a few days later. But the Lincoln family has always known the truth. Daniel didn't go to that hollow to argue over a few feet of dirt. He went there to demand an apology for his father. The property line was just the place where a boy's pride finally caught up with him. The election gave the McCoys the power, but it was that cruel joke that provided the spark. And that spark was about to ignite the whole damn county. The insult at the church social was a hot coal in Daniel Lincoln's gut. For days, it smoldered. He was only 16, but he had his father's unbending pride. He saw the way the other men looked at the colonel now with a hint of pity. He heard the whispers, and he saw the shame in his father's eyes, a look that cut the boy deeper than any knife. While the older men of the family spoke in hushed tones of political strategy and legal challenges, Daniel was consumed by a simpler, more primal code. An insult to his father's honor was an insult to the entire Lincoln name, and it had to be answered. He wasn't thinking of war or consequences. He was thinking like a son. He found Caleb McCoy, the boy who'd made the joke, working a stand of timber in a narrow hollow where their property lines blurred. It was a lonely place, the sound of the axe echoing off the steep hillsides, the air thick with the smell of pine sap. Daniel didn't come with a rifle leveled. He came on foot, his hands empty, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I want you to apologize to my father," Daniel said, his voice shaking but firm. Caleb McCoy, flush with the arrogance of his family's recent victory, just laughed. He leaned on his axe handle, a smirk on his face. "Your daddy's a cripple and his time is past," Caleb sneered. "Just like the rest of you Lincolns. Now get off my land before I run you off." He spat a wad of tobacco juice near Daniel's feet. That was the final spark. Daniel lunged, his fists clumsy but flying with all the pent-up rage of a wronged son. Caleb, bigger and a few years older, was taken by surprise but quickly recovered. The two boys tumbled to the ground, trading blows in the dirt and mud, a desperate, graceless fight fueled by generations of growing animosity. It wasn't a duel, it was a brawl. They rolled over roots and rocks, their grunts and curses swallowed by the vast indifference of the woods. The struggle carried them to the edge of a steep, rocky ravine that cut through the hollow. Caleb had Daniel pinned, his knuckles bloodying the boy's face. Daniel, in a surge of desperate strength, bucked and twisted, trying to throw him off. For a split second, their weight shifted. Caleb's boot slipped on a patch of wet moss. His eyes widened, his smirk replaced by a flash of genuine terror. He scrabbled for a handhold, but there was nothing but air. With a cry that was cut short by the sickening crack of a branch, he disappeared over the edge. Silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the gurgle of the creek below and Daniel's own ragged breaths. He crawled to the edge and looked down. Caleb McCoy lay twisted on the rocks below, his body unnaturally still. The fight was over. A 16-year-old boy, defending his father's honor, had just committed the first act of war. He scrambled back from the edge, a wave of cold horror washing over him, and he ran. He ran not as a victor, but as a terrified child who had just opened the gates of hell. When Caleb's body was found, the McCoys screamed for blood. Sheriff Jedediah McCoy declared it murder and swore to hang the Lincoln boy responsible. But Colonel Absalom Lincoln, seeing the terror in his own son's eyes, made a decision. He would not give his child to a McCoy sheriff and a McCoy mob. He gathered his clan, and at the funeral for the young Lincoln boy, because that is what the official story now became, a tragic hunting fall, he stood over the simple pine coffin and made his vow. "The law of this county is a tool for our enemies," he declared, his voice like iron. "From this day forward, we will be our own law, an eye for an eye, a life for a life." The point of no return had been crossed. The time for words was over. After a death like that, vengeance doesn't wait long in these mountains. It just waits for the right time and the right place. That place is here. I'm standing beside the Guyandotte River at a sharp, angry turn in the road that locals have called Devil's Elbow for as long as anyone can remember. Today, it's peaceful. The water rushes over the rocks and the sun filters down through a thick canopy of leaves. It's a beautiful, forgotten corner of the county. But if you know where to look, the scars are still here. This wide gravel shoulder I'm standing on isn't the original road. The old wagon trace ran closer to the water, right along the base of this sheer rock wall. And up there, about 50 feet above me, is a high wooded ridge that looks down on this entire bend. It's a perfect natural ambush point, a kill box designed by God himself. The sandstone up there is still pockmarked, weathered by a century of rain and ice, but you can still make them out. Dark little circles against the grey rock, each one a silent testament to the chaos that was unleashed right where I'm standing. This is where the Lincolns delivered their answer to the death of young Daniel. It wasn't a back-alley knife fight. It was a calculated military-style operation, planned and led by a man who had learned the art of war on the bloodiest battlefields in the nation. You have to imagine it. A slow-moving wagon, heavy with the payroll for a McCoy timber crew, rumbling down that narrow trace. The men inside, feeling safe, probably not even thinking of trouble. They never saw the shadows moving in the laurel up on that ridge. They only heard the sound of Colonel Lincoln's justice speaking all at once. The McCoy payroll wagon creaked its way along the river trace, moving at the slow, steady pace of the mules that pulled it. Inside, 3 McCoy kinsmen were relaxed, their rifles leaning against the wagon bed. The money, a heavy lockbox full of silver dollars, was a comforting weight between them. It was a warm afternoon in 1875. The air was sweet, and the only sounds were the jingle of the harness, the rumble of the wheels, and the endless rush of the Guyandotte. As they rounded Devil's Elbow, the high rock wall threw the road into deep shadow, offering a brief respite from the sun. It was the last moment of peace any of them would ever know. The first shot was not a warning. It was a declaration. A single sharp crack echoed from the ridge above, and the lead mule went down as if struck by lightning, its collapse throwing the entire wagon into a groaning, tangled halt. Before the McCoy men could even register what had happened, the ridge exploded in a volley of synchronized fire. It was not the scattered shooting of a brawl, it was the disciplined, concentrated fire of soldiers. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening wall of noise that hammered the wagon from above. The wooden sideboards of the wagon splintered instantly, peppered with a dozen heavy-caliber impacts. the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and hot lead. The man holding the reins was thrown backward from his seat, the leather straps falling from his hands. A second man, who had been scrambling for his rifle, suddenly slumped forward over the lockbox, his own weapon clattering, unfired, to the floorboards. The third and final man managed to raise his pistol and fire a single wild shot toward the trees before he too was silenced, collapsing in a heap beside his comrades. Then, as suddenly as it began, an absolute silence fell over the bend in the road. It was a heavy, profound quiet, broken only by the panicked breathing of the remaining mule and the ceaseless murmur of the river. From the dense laurel on the ridge, a line of figures emerged, moving with quiet purpose down the steep incline. They were led by Colonel Absalom Lincoln. His face was grim, his eyes cold and methodical. He was not a man consumed by rage. He was a commander inspecting a battlefield after a successful engagement. He walked to the wagon and looked upon the scene of instant, overwhelming destruction. His men watched him, waiting for a command. Absalom surveyed the interior of the wagon, his gaze falling upon the untouched lockbox full of silver. He made no move toward it. This was not about money. This was about payment of a different kind. Reaching into his own pocket, he pulled out a single spent rifle cartridge, a 56 Spencer, the signature of his old cavalry unit, and placed it deliberately on the driver's seat. It was a message, a signature left in brass and smoke. He turned without another word and led his men back into the woods, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a monument of splintered wood and terrible silence. The war had begun in earnest. After the smoke clears and the bodies are carried away, the machinery of the law, however rusty and biased, has to turn. And this is what it produces. This is the official coroner's inquest, filed in the Lincoln County Courthouse just 2 days after the ambush at Devil's Elbow. The handwriting is a spidery, formal script on paper that has gone thin and brown with age, but the words themselves are cold, hard, and clipped. They are the official story, the version of events that was meant to be preserved for history. I'll read you the key passage. It says, "The deceased, identified as Silas McCoy, John R. McCoy, and Peter Vance, did come to their deaths by means of multiple gunshot wounds. Evidence suggests the attack was carried out from the high ridge overlooking the road. The company payroll box, containing approximately $200, was found undisturbed. The perpetrators are, at this time, unknown. Perpetrators unknown." In a county this small, where every family knows every other family's business, that phrase is a lie. A necessary, legal lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. The whole county knew who had the skill to organize an attack like that. The whole county knew who owned Spencer repeating rifles. And the whole county knew who had a fresh grudge and a score to settle. This document, in its sterile official language, scrubs the passion from the event. It doesn't mention the insult at the church social or the death of a 16-year-old boy. It reduces Colonel Lincoln's methodical act of vengeance to a simple, anonymous triple homicide. But this dry, passionless report was more than just a historical record. For Sheriff Jedediah McCoy, it was a weapon. It was the legal justification he'd been waiting for. It transformed a family feud into a matter of state law. Armed with this piece of paper, he could deputize his kinsmen, raise a posse, and legally ride out to the Lincoln homestead, not as an avenging McCoy, but as the High Sheriff of Lincoln County, serving a warrant and hunting down fugitives. The law had officially chosen a side. Sheriff Jedediah McCoy didn't waste a moment. That coroner's report was the only authority he needed, a piece of tin and paper that gave his vengeance the color of law. He deputized a dozen men that very day. This was no impartial posse of civic-minded citizens. It was a swarm of angry hornets. Every man was a McCoy by blood or by payroll, their faces hard, their eyes alight with a hunger for retribution. They rode out from Hamlin not as peacekeepers, but as an army, with Sheriff McCoy at their head, the warrants for Absalom Lincoln's sons tucked safely in his coat pocket. Their destination was the Lincoln homestead. They thundered up the hollow, a column of armed horsemen that was a clear and brutal message. This was not an attempt at a quiet arrest. It was a show of force meant to intimidate and to break the will of the Lincoln clan. But when they arrived, they found not a terrified family, but a fortress. The heavy shutters were barred on the windows, the porch was empty, and the long barrels of several rifles poked from carefully cut loopholes in the log walls. Colonel Absalom Lincoln himself stepped out onto the porch, his Spencer rifle held ready in his one good hand. Sheriff McCoy held up the warrants. "Absalom, I'm here for your boys by the authority of Lincoln County." The colonel's reply was as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "Your authority ends where my property begins, Jedediah. Your piece of paper means nothing here. Now turn your riders around before I am forced to defend my home." For a long, tense moment, the two sides faced each other in absolute silence. Then, a nervous McCoy deputy shifted his weight, his horse stamped, and a rifleman inside the Lincoln house took it as a threat. A single shot cracked the stillness, kicking up dirt just in front of McCoy's horse. That was all it took. The posse unleashed a ragged volley of fire at the house, which was answered by the disciplined, withering fire of the defenders. McCoy's men were exposed, out in the open, and after several minutes of taking the worst of the exchange, they were forced into a humiliating retreat back down the hollow. Furious and thwarted, Jedediah and Elias McCoy devised a new strategy. If they couldn't take the Lincoln fort, they would seize the counties. They rode their posse back into Hamlin, but they didn't disperse. Instead, they dismounted and, in a shocking act of insurrection, stormed the county courthouse. They threw out the Lincoln-appointed clerk and barricaded the doors. From the windows of the very building meant to dispense justice, McCoy riflemen now aimed their weapons out at the town square. There was no trial. There was no capture. The verdict was delivered by Jedediah McCoy himself, who hung a hand-painted sign from the courthouse balcony. "By order of the sheriff, martial law is in effect. All sympathizers of the Lincoln clan will be deemed outlaws." The pursuit of the law had ended with the law itself being taken hostage. Lincoln County now had two armed camps, two governments. The Lincolns, barricaded in their home, and the McCoys, ruling from a stolen courthouse. The town of Hamlin became a no-man's land where the slightest movement could draw a sniper's bullet, and the promise of a full-scale battle hung over the valley like a storm cloud waiting to break. Every war, no matter how large or small, ends in the same place, a quiet plot of ground under a silent sky. I'm here now, in the old Hamlin Cemetery, a place where the stones lean like tired old men, and the stories they tell are slowly being erased by wind and rain. The grass is high, and the only sound is the drone of cicadas in the ancient oaks. I came here to find the final chapters of the two men who started it all, to see where their ambition and their bitterness finally led them. It wasn't hard to find Colonel Absalom Lincoln. His grave is on a small rise overlooking the valley. It's a simple, dignified stone of grey granite, the kind a soldier would choose. The inscription is clear and deep: Colonel Absalom Lincoln, CSA, beloved father and husband. A small, sun-bleached Confederate flag is planted in the earth beside it, a sign that even after all these years, someone still comes here to remember the man and the cause he fought for. His legacy, at least to his own family, is one of honor. Finding Black Elias McCoy was a different story. His grave is tucked away in a low-lying corner of the cemetery, where the water gathers and the weeds grow thickest. His headstone was clearly once more expensive than the colonel's, a tall, ornate piece of marble, but time has been cruel to it. It's tilted badly, stained dark green with moss, and a thick vein of ivy is slowly choking the inscription. I had to pull it away to even read the name. Here lies the man who wanted to drag the county into the modern age, the man who dealt in railroads and northern money, yet his final resting place is forgotten, sinking back into the earth. And here is the final bitter irony of the Lincoln County War. They lie just 100 yards apart now. The proud colonel and the ambitious McCoy, enemies who set the hills on fire with their hatred, are now silent neighbors for eternity. They fought for control of a whole county, for timber rights and political power, and in the end, this is all they hold, a 6-foot plot of dirt. Their war of sieges and snipers didn't last forever. It had to end. And standing here between their graves, the question becomes unavoidable. What was the final act that brought these two powerful men to this quiet, humble end? The journey from the courthouse siege to those two lonely graves was not a short one. It was a slow, grinding descent into a hell of their own making. The standoff was eventually broken by a traveling circuit judge, a brave man named Theron Parsons, who rode into Hamlin flanked by federal marshals. He brokered a fragile truce, a peace as thin as January ice, forcing the McCoys to relinquish the courthouse and the Lincolns to lay down their arms under the threat of state intervention. For a few tense months, an uneasy quiet settled over the county, but the hate was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. That fragile peace was shattered by a single rifle shot in the summer of 1878. Judge Parsons, seen as sympathetic to the Lincolns, was sitting on the porch of his boarding house when a bullet from the shadows found him. The assassination was a message. There was no room for impartial law in Lincoln County. The truce was over. The act was so brazen, so final, that it pushed both sides past the point of no return. The rules of engagement, if there ever were any, were burned along with the judge's body on the funeral pyre. The conflict then devolved into a new, more ruinous kind of warfare: economic destruction. One moonless night, McCoy riders swept through the Lincoln holdings, their torches finding the grist mill and the barns full of the year's harvest. The orange glow against the night sky was visible for miles, a signal that the McCoys were no longer just trying to win, but to erase the Lincolns from the land entirely. The retaliation was swift and terrible. The Lincolns, led by Absalom's remaining sons, no longer targeted barns. They targeted homes, setting fire to the McCoy homesteads and driving women and children out into the cold. It was a war of total annihilation, where the goal was to leave the enemy with nothing but ashes. This was the war that finally broke both clans. Black Elias McCoy, for all his cunning, found his fortune turning to ash in his hands. He had spent everything on hired guns, legal fees and bribes, and with his timber operations constantly under threat, his northern business partners abandoned him. He died a few years later, not from a bullet, but a broken man, his dreams of a McCoy dynasty ruined, leaving little behind but debts and a legacy of hate. Colonel Absalom Lincoln met a more direct, but no less tragic, end. In the spring of 1880, believing the worst of the fighting was over, he was out plowing his field, trying to bring life back to the soil that had soaked up so much blood. The man who had survived Gettysburg, who had fortified his home against a sheriff's army, was shot in the back by an unknown assassin from the tree line. He died with his hand on the plow. With the patriarchs of both families gone, the war simply ran out of fuel. The long shadow it cast, however, would stretch for generations, a darkness that fell not just on the families who fought, but on the very soul of the county itself. You might think that after 150 years, the dust would have settled, and the story of the Lincoln County War would be just that, a story. But you'd be wrong. The shooting may have stopped in 1880, but the war of words, the war of whispers and memory, never truly ended. It's still being fought today in quiet conversations on front porches and at family reunions. The truth of what happened depends entirely on who you ask, because in Lincoln County, history isn't a single solid thing. It's a fractured mirror, and every family holds a piece. To this day, if you find someone with the last name Lincoln, they will tell you a story of heroes and villains. In their version, Colonel Absalom Lincoln was a tragic patriarch, a man of unshakable honor who was forced to defend his family and his way of life against a tide of corruption. The McCoys were nothing but greedy upstarts, puppets for northern industrialists who stole an election and used a tainted badge to wage a campaign of terror. The ambush at Devil's Elbow wasn't murder, It was justice. Fortifying their home wasn't insurrection. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. Absalom Lincoln, they'll tell you, died a martyr for the old ways. But go down the road a few miles to a hollow where the McCoy name is still common, and you will hear a very different tale. They'll tell you Black Elias McCoy was a visionary, a man of progress who saw a future for Lincoln County beyond subsistence farming and isolation. He was trying to bring jobs, money, and the railroad into these hills, but he was blocked at every turn by the Lincolns, a violent, stubborn clan who couldn't accept that the world had changed. In their story, the Lincolns were the aggressors, murderers who killed a boy over a petty squabble and ambushed honest men on a public road. Jedediah McCoy wasn't a crooked sheriff. He was a brave lawman trying to bring killers to justice in the face of an armed rebellion. So who was the hero and who was the villain? The truth, as it so often does in these mountains, probably lives somewhere in the grey shadows between those two stories. Most of the other old families in the county, the ones who weren't Lincolns or McCoys, have their own version. They'll tell you it was a pointless feud between two proud, power-hungry clans that tore the county apart, bled it dry, and left it weak and vulnerable. They see both Absalom and Elias not as heroes or villains, but as two stubborn old fools who, in their fight over who would rule the county, ended up destroying it for everyone, paving the way for the real conquerors, the coal and timber companies who bought up the land for pennies on the dollar from the widows and orphans left behind. When a story is carved into a place with this much blood and sorrow, the facts themselves often become too heavy to carry. Over the generations, the sharp, painful edges of history get worn smooth and the story transforms. It stops being a dry account of an election and an ambush, and it becomes something else entirely, a legend. The Lincoln County War didn't just leave scars on the landscape. It left ghosts in the minds of the people, specters that still walk the high ridges and whisper in the deep hollows. The most enduring of these is the tale of the phantom rider of Hart's Creek. Even now, some old-timers will tell you that if you're out on the ridges at dusk, you might see him, a lone figure on a pale horse silhouetted against the dying light. He never gets close, never makes a sound. He just watches. During the war, men from both sides claim to have seen him right before a killing, a silent omen of the violence to come. Some say he's the ghost of a soldier, eternally watching his home tear itself apart. Others believe he is death himself, drawn to these hills by the sheer volume of hate. The historical fact of the ambushes and killings has been given a supernatural guardian, a way for the people to personify the sense of doom that hung over the county. This is how the community processed the trauma. The raw greed of Black Elias McCoy was too mundane, so it was transformed into a legend of a devil's bargain, a story that he sold the souls of his kinsmen to a dark-suited stranger in exchange for power. The cold-blooded tactics of Colonel Lincoln were easier to understand if you believed he was acting under a curse laid on the land by a crooked surveyor. The facts of the war became the bones, but folklore, ghost stories, and cautionary tales grew over them like flesh. It's the final stage in a story's life, the moment history dissolves and a legend is born to carry the emotional truth of what was lost. And so we find ourselves back where we started, here at the lonely chimney, standing sentinel over the ghost of the Lincoln homestead. When we first stood here, this was just a pile of stones, a forgotten ruin in a tangle of weeds. But it's not just a ruin anymore, is it? Now we see it for what it is. It's a monument. It's a testament to the pride of a one-armed colonel, to the fury of a son defending his father's honor, and to the terrible final silence that fell when the war was over. These stones are heavy with the weight of that story, a story of how a home can become a fortress, and how a fortress can become a tomb. We have walked a long and bloody road today, from a dusty newspaper archive to a quiet front porch where memories are still kept alive. We stood at Devil's Elbow, where justice was delivered from the barrel of a rifle, and we walked between the graves of two old enemies who are now neighbors in the silent earth. We have seen how a political squabble, fueled by a simple, cruel insult, could ignite a fire that would consume 2 families and poison a county for 100 years. The ultimate tragedy of the Lincoln County War is that in the end, nobody won. The Lincolns and the McCoys fought over who would control the future of these hills, and they fought with such ferocity that they destroyed each other. Their war left a vacuum, a void of power and leadership that was quickly filled by the very outsiders they both, in their own ways, distrusted. The coal and timber barons swept in, and the true conquest of Lincoln County began, not with a gunshot, but with the stroke of a pen on a deed. So the next time you pass a forgotten ruin on a lonely road, remember that it's not just a pile of stones. It's a library filled with stories of love, loss, and the choices that define us. The people are gone, the houses are gone, but the story remains.